So, military blunders. I wanted to start with a good one, and there was a movie out recently, years ago, called 300. And it's about the Spartan defense of Thermopylae against the Persians. And it's a really good movie if you haven't seen it. It is in no way historically accurate, but damn, it's a good movie. I really like it. This particular battle takes place after that. And our old friend Xerxes is involved. Alright, so let's just jump in with both feet. The Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. There are military commanders throughout history who were outmaneuvered. And this can be from a variety of different reasons, many different reasons. Bad intelligence, turncoats, traitors, double agents, treachery, being caught unawares. There's all kinds of reasons. And most of these commanders essentially just had a bad day. Every commander has bad days. There are no perfect generals. Every military commander in history has suffered at least one defeat. So nobody's perfect. But it takes a special kind of stupid to blunder into the same type of trap, fighting the same enemy twice. Enter stage left, Xerxes. Thanks to the movie 300, we're all familiar with the Spartans' defense of Thermopylae. The Spartans were Greeks, and Xerxes was Persian. The hubris of Xerxes was legendary. Quick recap. Thermopylae means the hot gates, and what it is there's a narrow mountain pass. The Spartans were defending that mountain pass against the vast superior numbers of Persians, but because only so many of them could get in there at a time, the Spartans were having a field day with them. The only reason that the Persians won that was because a traitor, a treacherous individual, showed them a trail so they could get troops behind the Spartans and essentially surround them from both sides. They couldn't defend both sides. So that's how the Spartans were defeated. And it was only through treachery. That happened, and then later on, here we go. The Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. The Persian fleet of 1,200 vessels was lured into the narrow straits between Salamis and the coast of Attica. Very narrow pass, and the Greek leader, his name was Themistocles. He had sent out some disinformation, bad information, saying that the Corinthian vessels were going to retreat. When the Persians were approaching, they saw what they saw was Greek vessels turning and running. So of course they gave chase, because that's what you do. Well, they got bottled into this narrow strait here between Salamis and the coast of Attica. And they got bottled in there, and then some more Greeks showed up behind them. They were hidden in a little cove, and they come out behind them, so they were bottled in both sides. The lighter and more nimble trireme and pentaconter vessels of the Greek navy were more suited to fighting in the narrow confines of that strait. And they were ramming ships, they were shooting them, and they just had a field day because the Persians were stuck. They couldn't move. Xerxes in his now you got to admire Xerxes' arrogance if nothing else. He had set up a throne overlooking the strait to view what he perceived to be a great victory for his navy. Instead, what he watched was his massive fleet get caught in the narrow confines, and the Greek navy destroyed over 200 of them before his remaining vessels could turn tail and run. This is virtually the exact same type of tactic that the Spartans had employed at the Hot Gates. While the Persians enjoyed a victory at Thermopylae, the cost in dead and wounded were staggering. I can see Xerxes being confident in the superiority of his fleet because he had massive numbers. The The Greeks under Themistocles only had 300 or 400 vessels, so he enjoyed a huge advantage over them. But he underestimated the Greeks before. What in God's name would let him fall for the exact same tactic again? Disinformation can be a very powerful weapon, and Themistocles had propagated this disinformation that said that the Greek fleet was fleeing the area, and Xerxes took that bait, hook, line, and sinker. This exact same tactic, and he fell for it again. He got stuck in his fleet got stuck in a narrow strait, just like the Hot Gates, and the superior Greeks just beat the shit out of him. It takes a special kind of stupid to walk into a buzzsaw twice. That's all I'm saying. In 216 BC, Hannibal was running wild with his army and causing the Romans all kinds of trouble. At that point in time, Hannibal's forces seemed invincible. The Romans, in an attempt to stop him, assembled a force of 80,000 soldiers, which outnumbered Hannibal's Carthaginians by about 10,000 men. These Roman soldiers were of a high standard and were led by L. Aemilius Paulus and C. Terentius Varro. I hope I got those names right. Hannibal's men consisted of Gauls, Spaniards, and Numidians, as well as Carthaginians. This is a very, very famous battle. These two forces met right near the town of Cannae on the river Ophius. The Romans initially ordered an infantry charge, and Hannibal's center gave way. This was not a collapse, but rather a tactical move. He set up his infantry in the middle with his cavalry on the flanks, and when the Romans charged, they hit the center, and his center gave way. But it wasn't a collapse. He intended to do that. This was called a tactical retreat. As the center fell back, the Romans moved forward. The ends of Hannibal's lines were staffed with his best troops, and as the Romans moved forward, these elite forces enveloped them. A terrible slaughter ensued. The Romans had 46,000 killed and 22,000 captured, while Hannibal lost around 7,000 men. At the time, this was the largest single defeat in Roman history. Actually, I think it still is the single biggest Roman defeat in history. The blunder here was the lack of fluidity in the battle plan. Anytime you have a battle plan, you have an objective and you have a means to get there. That's the main thrust of any battle plan. Once that battle plan happens, once you engage that battle, most times that shit goes out the window. The blunder here was that once the battle started, the Romans plodded on single-mindedly and did not pay attention to how the battle was unfolding. Every battle plan, and I don't care how much intel or how meticulous the planning, every battle plan must be fluid enough to adapt to a changing battlefield. The best battle plan in the world usually goes to shit once the battle starts. Battle commanders have to watch the situation so they can make the adjustments necessary to counter what the enemy does. Paulus and Varro sent in the play and did have no options for audibles or anything. Their men advanced into a meat grinder, and nobody said, "Wait, they're moving in around you on a pincher." Nobody said, "Wait, they're coming in around the sides." Nobody said, "Wait, stop, get out of there." Basically what this boils down to is they had a battle plan, and the battle plan was to run over the enemy. Well, apparently Hannibal knew that battle plan and planned accordingly. So yeah, whenever you send your men into battle, you have to be able to adjust your plan. They didn't adjust. They just went straight ahead. Sometimes it's not the easiest. The shortest distance between 2 points is being the straight line. Sometimes that's not the best path. Just saying. Okay, and for those of you who do wargaming, this is an excellent study in how not to conduct warfare. Every commander can make mistakes. Expected. But when you make these classic, oh my God, ridiculous blunders, yeah, that's on them. I'm just saying. I'm talking about the Battle of Hattin, Hattin, in 1187. One of the key military points in any type of warfare is to fight the enemy on your terms. You use your strengths against his weaknesses. Anytime you attack his strong points with your disadvantages, you are asking for trouble. In 1187, the Crusader King Guy of Jerusalem did not heed this advice. A little bit of context. The Muslim forces under Saladin had laid siege, to the town of Tiberias on the western shores of the Sea of Galilee. King Guy was about 20 miles away at Sephoria with a large army, about 20,000 infantry, and over 1,200 cavalry. So he had a good force. He had a sizable force. That would make any military commander, take notice. Guy wanted to engage Saladin before he could strike Jerusalem. You got the Sea of Galilee here. This is the west. This is the east over here. You got the Sea of Galilee. Tiberias is right here on the coast. And Sephoria is over this direction. Jerusalem is down south. So he wanted to hit Saladin before he could march south, because he didn't know if he could get his forces between Saladin and Jerusalem, so he wanted to hit Tiberias while Saladin was there. One of Guy's senior leaders, Raymond III of Tripoli, argued against attacking Saladin's forces at Tiberias, because Muslim forces were at their best on open ground. He advised Guy to stay at Sephoria and fight a defensive action, which makes sense. There's merit to both of them. But seeing as the Muslims were so good on open ground and armored infantry is not, a defensive battle, 20,000 guys could defend Sephoria quite easily, quite well. So I understand Raymond's idea, but I also understand Guy, because he wants to keep Jerusalem. That's the objective of the Crusades. So, and then I guess technically there was no guarantee that Saladin would attack Sephoria. He could have bypassed it. At any rate, he advised Guy to stay at Sephoria and fight a defensive action. Guy overruled him and set off for Tiberias on July 3rd, 1187. That date is important. July 3rd. Keep that in mind. The Muslims excelled at open ground combat because they had the mounted archers. These mounted archers began harrying attacks on the Crusaders, attack and hit and run kind of attacks, harassing them, causing them to stop continuously all day long. These attacks caused many casualties and forced the Crusaders to use their water much more quickly. July in the Middle East is hotter than the fires of damnation. The Crusaders wore armor of various types. In the heat of July, with no water, imagine. Yeah. The situation was made worse when the Crusader army had to make night camp on an arid plain near Mascana. The next morning, the Crusaders found themselves encircled by massed infantry and cavalry of Saladin's Muslims. Saladin was a military mastermind. He was really good. The man could fight. He was good. On a battlefield, he was nothing to be taken lightly. Desperate for water and plagued with many infantry desertions, Guy's cavalry made 3 bloody and fruitless charges trying to break the Muslim lines and reach the Horns of Hattin, Hattin, the Horns of Hattin, which is an extinct volcano offering the prospect of spring water. The Crusader army finally collapsed due to lack of water and appalling casualties. Only about 3,000 of those Crusaders made it to safety. This defeat and others like it eventually led to the fall of Jerusalem on October 2nd of that year. Here's the thing. Had Guy listened to Raymond, his army might have survived. He'd had a better chance to survive with that defensive action. If he really was worried about Jerusalem, he could have moved his army south and mounted a defense there. Instead, Guy let himself be lured into an arid plain against an enemy that was bred for it. These guys knew what they were doing on open ground in the desert. It was literally their specialty. Guy played their game by their rules, and guess what? He lost. That's one of the classic military blunders, and I can't imagine a worse scenario for a commander than watching your men waste away like that from lack of water, knowing you had an alternative. Just saying. In 1297, William Wallace was causing the English no end of trouble. If you've seen the movie Braveheart, that's basically who this character is. That movie was based on this character. He was a smart, capable, and popular leader. His rebels were, in many ways, a ragtag army of very, very low social rank, many armed with homemade weaponry, but they knew the terrain and they were very, very effective. The English sent an army led by John de Warenne, Warrenne, the Earl of Surrey, to eliminate the rebels. The English army, mostly cavalry, reached the natural obstacle, the River Forth, near the town of Stirling. The most obvious crossing point was the narrow wooden Stirling Bridge. It was an easy route favored by Warenne. Problem was, it was a narrow wooden bridge. In military terms, that's called a choke point. You can get caught there, and your guys can't maneuver, and they're stuck there, easy pickings. Veteran soldiers advised the inexperienced Warenne to ford the river at a safer place about a mile away. Warenne ignored these veterans and ordered the army to cross the bridge. Unbeknownst to the English, the Scottish rebels were in a position across the river overlooking the bridge. They didn't attack them on the bridge. They waited. That's an important thing here. The ground on the other side of the bridge was boggy and generally hampered cavalry movement. Furthermore, the curve in the river prevented the English from making a proper battle formation. Wallace waited until about half the English had crossed the bridge before launching his attack. The English could not organize to fight coherently, and their reinforcements were stuck on the other side of the river. In the ensuing slaughter, the English cavalry was hewn down in less than an hour. They slaughtered them. Holy crap, it was ridiculous. Here's the thing. Here's the blunder part of it. A military leader has to know his weaknesses. A military leader has to know what's going on in his army. If a military leader does not listen to his men, he's an idiot. If he's not experienced and he does not listen to his more experienced men, he's worse. His more experienced veterans, including Sir Ralph Lundy, tried to show him a better way, but he ignored them. This cost him 5,500 English troops, mounted cavalry. His army had to retreat. You got to know your own weaknesses. In this case, inexperience was his weakness. Whenever you know you have a weakness, you have to find a way to compensate for that weakness. In this particular case, you got to listen to the men who know what the hell they're doing. There are military stories throughout history that are rife with other stories about, well, you know, the new leader came in, he didn't listen to the sergeant and got a bunch of guys killed. The new leader came in, he didn't listen to the guys who'd been there a while, and he got killed. It's all over the place. You can't swing a dead cat in military circles without listening to a story like that. Um, you got to listen to your men, especially the ones who have been there, who know what the hell they're talking about. It's just the way it is. So that was his blunder. He didn't listen to the guys that knew what they were doing. So the Battle of Agincourt, Agincourt. I've heard it pronounced Agincourt and Agincourt. I'm going with Agincourt. Excuse me. Something to drink. Gotta have good coffee in your life, you know what I mean? Alright. The Battle of Agincourt had long-reaching effects in both England and France. It established the legitimacy of the Lancastrian monarchy in England. It caused factions within France to go to war. Combined, these two effectively allowed King Henry V 18 months to gear up and invade France again, to great success. This particular battle took place during the 100 Years' War. Agincourt took place in a plowed field in northern France in 1415. During the 100 Years' War, King Henry V had been campaigning in France for several months and was en route back to Calais to re-equip and get reinforcements. His forces had been reduced to less than 6,000. Many of these were suffering from disease, and they had been wounded, they were weakened, that kind of thing. They were not in good shape. Seeing this, Constable Charles d'Albret, D''Albret, Charles d'Albret, mustered some 25,000 men, commanded by various lords, commanders, and nobles. He put them at Agincourt to block Henry's retreat. The French were convinced that their 3-to-1 superiority in numbers would give them an easy victory, and it should have. 3-to-1, they should have wiped the floor with them. Heavy rain, this is what killed them. Heavy rain had turned the plowed field into deep mud. And that was the impetus for their undoing. D'Albret began the battle with 2 completely inadequate cavalry charges. These 2 charges were broken up by English archers. So you got a deep mud in a field, and you send your cavalry across, which, by the way, is going to slow them down. And on the way over, the English are saying, "Oh, look, there's people to shoot at." Pap, 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 pap. Yeah. The English had the longbow, which was far superior to anything else on the battlefield at the time. These longbowmen were extremely accurate, and they were very, very effective. Here's another mistake that d'Albret made. Before the cavalry had returned, he launched a foot assault of 8,000 men-at-arms. So now you've got footmen slogging across this muddy field. When the cavalry fell back, they crashed into the French footmen. Excuse me. Still fighting that cold, you gotta bear with me. As the French soldiers slogged through the deep mud, the English longbowmen enveloped them in clouds of arrows. This is essentially the same effect that the barbed wire had in World War I. I did a video on this on the Battle of the Somme. They stretch barbed wire across, and when the enemy comes across, they hit the barbed wire, they have to stop and cut it. Well, while they're standing still, the machine gunners just ripped them apart. Here, the mud slowed them down and kept them from moving quickly, and the English longbowmen just tore them apart. Same effect. The footmen were so tightly packed together that the English could hardly miss. And then, adding to the debacle, d'Albret added even more troops to the mix. Curiously, he failed to make use of his own archers and crossbowmen. They weren't as good as the longbowmen, but they could have done something. The French did try an attack around the rear and threaten the English camp, but this was fought off. Henry then ordered the massacre of hundreds of French prisoners already taken to keep them from threatening his force. He didn't have, and a lot of people think this was bloodthirsty on his part, and maybe so. But look at it from his point of view. You got 6,000 men. You're being threatened by a force of 25,000. You cannot spare the troops. And by the way, you're 6,000 men. Most of them, many of them are wounded and sick. You cannot spare the troops to watch the prisoners. You can't do it. It was a military decision. And I hate to say it, but I might have made the same decision. I don't know. It depends on the circumstance and the situation, but militarily, he may have made the right call. Was it mean and bloodthirsty? Yes. But so is war. When you're fighting for your life, you do what you got to do. You know what I'm saying? The French suffered a catastrophic defeat, losing 8,000 men, including some 5,000 nobles. They lost 90 to 120 great lords and bannerets. D'Albret was also killed. The loss of these lords caused massive internal upheaval in France and was the impetus for infighting among factions of the French nobility. What D'Albret simply failed to do was pick terrain that would work to his advantage. Then he failed to work his strengths to take advantage of his enemy's weaknesses. He tried a hammer where he could have used a screwdriver, essentially. The areas on each side of Henry's path were wooded, hiding his cavalry and archers in the trees and presenting his footmen across the path on the other side of that field would have halted Henry's men. This is what I would have done. You got woods on either side of this muddy field. On the far side, away from Henry, you put your footmen. You put your cavalry, hide them in the trees along with your archers. Henry's plodding along, bebopping down the road. He hits this mud. He says, holy crap, there's a bunch of French footmen over there. We got to stop and figure this out. While he's figuring it out, the archers hit his men, who are exposed. The longbowmen would have had a serious issue firing back into the trees because the French would have had cover. Once the English figure out their problem and they turn to move a different way, that's when you send your cavalry and whack them. That's what I would have done. Never ever count your chickens before they hatch. My contention there would be, if you can get the cavalry behind him while he's at the mud, you could have forced Henry, to try to cross that muddy field. Then he would have been trapped in between the cavalry, the archers, and the footmen. You see what I'm saying? It would have been a game changer. D'Albret simply tried to pound on him until he died, and Henry was not an idiot, but it wouldn't have taken a genius to defeat that battle plan. That's all I'm saying. D'Albret screwed the pooch is what it boils down to. I hope the Battle of Bosworth. One of the basic military requirements of any force is that all of the troops have to be fighting on the same side. You don't necessarily have to believe in the cause, but you at least have to not be fighting for the other side. That's the main thing. In 1485, Henry Tudor was threatening Richard III of York. Henry had around 5,000 men, including 2,000 mercenaries he'd acquired on a recruitment trip through Wales. A lot of them were French, and they were good mercenaries. They were very experienced men. Richard had a force in excess of over 10,000. He had bribed many lords for their men, and he had kidnapped the son of Sir Thomas Stanley to force the addition of his troops and his brother's troops, Sir William Stanley's, as well. Each of these lords sent about 3,000. So he had a sizable force, but a lot of them he had bribed and a lot of them he had forced to join. Richard ranked his men in 3 battles, or they're equivalent to divisions, on or around Ambion Hill. When the Stanley brothers' troops arrived, they positioned their troops off to the sides of the battlefield rather than join Richard's main force. On August 22nd, the battle began. Forces of Richard's began a cavalry charge. When Richard saw Henry and his bodyguard separated from the main force, he charged and started hacking his way towards his adversary. So the battle starts. There's a cavalry charge. Richard saw Henry with some of his bodyguards off to the side, and so he immediately charged them, and some forces intervened, and he was hacking his way through to get to his enemy. At that point, the Stanleys attacked Richard. They attacked his forces. They were on either side, and they just right in, both sides. Richard was surrounded, and his force was battered to death. Richard's army was crushed. Henry became King Henry VII. The deciding factor here was not militarily, strategically, and tactically. Every action that was taken was sound. What failed Richard was his politics. He tried to force people to fight for him by threatening their family. Blood is thicker than water and, for most, stronger than steel. Somebody threatens my family, they're not getting my help. They're not getting my help at all. I'm going to do whatever I can to undermine them, hamstring them, kneecap them, whatever it takes. I'll bring a bat. I don't give a flying fuck. Somebody comes after my family, yeah, they're fucked. When the Stanleys set up their men on the sides away from Richard's main force, that should have been a red flag. I don't know if the Stanleys were in contact with Henry, but even if they were not, the effect could not have been much worse for Richard. Your troops have to be committed to your cause. Not necessarily as in, yes, we want this man to, they have to be willing to fight for you. If they're your men, they have to be willing to die for you. They have to be committed in that respect. If you're going onto a battlefield, you have to believe in the cause. You may not have to believe in that person, but you have to believe in the cause enough to fight the other side. You see what I'm saying? If the troops fighting for you are not loyal to your side, at least, you're done. Period. When your own troops turn on you, you're done. That's all there is to it. And that was the politics is what failed Richard. It wasn't the military strategy or tactics. It was the politics. And when you're building an army, politics matters. That's all there is to it. On Napoleon's Russian invasion. Those of you who haven't heard, who don't know what this is, this is a case in point in, logistics or, let me just start at the beginning. In June of 1812, the French General Napoleon invaded Russia with some 600,000 soldiers. 600,000 soldiers. His idea was to defeat the Russian army in a decisive battle and then dictate the terms for peace which would force Russian concessions. So his goal was political, but I don't think he thought it through real well. At any rate, Napoleon knew that he couldn't advance an army of 600,000 on a 500-mile march without significant supply lines. With that in mind, he created an enormous supply train to follow his troops. Even this massive logistical support would prove to be inadequate. Napoleon advanced from the Duchy of Warsaw into Russia. Instead of engaging his army, the Russians adopted a strategy of retreat in depth. They retreated and destroyed any crops and other supplies which may be useful to the enemy. This stretched the French supply lines to the breaking point. I want to say it's the term they use now is scorched earth, but what it is you retreat and give ground, but don't give the enemy anything to use. Eventually, his supply lines get so long that he's stymied. He can't do anything else. You eliminate him through logistics. Now, they did the same thing with the Germans in World War II, because the greatest ally, and you're going to see this here in a minute, the greatest ally the Russians have ever had is the Russian winter. Nobody has been able to get past that bad boy. Okay? By the time Napoleon's army reached Smolensk, they'd lost at least 90,000 men through disease and starvation. Russian and French forces finally clashed at Borodino on September 7th. The French scored a narrow victory which cost them another 30,000 men. The Russians continued to retreat. On 14 September, the French army took Moscow, which had been deserted and burned, to eliminate shelter and food sources. By 19 October, the French army had lost more than 500,000 men. He started out with 600,000. He's lost over 500,000 now. With no sign of Russian capitulation, the French were forced to retreat. Now here's where it gets vicious. The retreat from Moscow was an unimaginable horror. Starving soldiers ate anything they could find, including rats, crows, and their own horses. Many resorted to cannibalism. The Russian winter froze thousands, and the Cossack Russians harried the French on a daily basis, spreading fear and death. The attempt to cross the frozen Berezina River alone cost 13,000 French lives. So the retreat was worse than the attack. Napoleon, what this boiled down to is Napoleon was a victim of his own hubris. His overconfidence kept him from realizing what was happening. The initial incursion was well thought out and planned, but once it was realized that the Russians were drawing him in, he should have known that such long supply lines would be untenable. Once the French reached Smolensk, and he had lost almost one-sixth of his force to starvation and disease, he should have retreated, or at least stopped there. You stop there, you set up a defensive perimeter while you can still supply your troops. You see what I'm saying? You have a chance at supplying troops. If you can't hold that, you retreat. But his hubris, he was overconfident, and his hubris made him continue. And as I understand it, something like 20,000 men of his men survived that debacle. Started out with 600,000 and ended up at 20,000. If I remember correctly, that was the numbers. Now, that being said, nobody has successfully invaded Russia. The only time Russia's been defeated per se was when internal forces changed governments, things like that, internal coups, what do you call it? Rebellions and uprisings, that kind of thing. As far as I know, nobody's ever defeated Russia in a war. And the reason being is once they get started fighting in Russia in the winter, they figure out that, gee, it's cold, we should get the hell out of here. And unless you're at Stalingrad, I did a video on that, check it out, in which case the guys were like, well, we want to leave, and the leader was like, no, stay. Because he was given bad information. He was told by one of his guys that the Air Force could supply them, and that didn't happen. In this particular instance, Napoleon should have seen what was going on when they hit Smolensk, and he didn't, because he was so assured of his own greatness. His hubris killed all those men. That's what it boils down to. So keep in mind, if you're playing a game or trying to wage a war, and I don't know why you would be waging a war, but my point is, in wartime, you have to look past your own misconceptions. Napoleon thought he could do anything, and he was wrong. Also, I have another channel called The Grumpy Old Gamer, and if you're a war gamer like me, historical research helps, because you know what not to do in a gaming setting. Alright, here we go. Military blunders. Antietam, 1862. This was the single bloodiest day of the American Civil War. I'm not taking sides in this, one way or the other. I had family that fought for the North, but I'm not taking sides. Anybody who thinks I am is grossly mistaken. Slavery is bad, period. Now, context. General George B. McClellan led the Union Army of the Potomac, and General Robert E. Lee led the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. On September 4th, 1862, Lee crossed the Potomac River to invade Maryland. This spurred a week. Spurred. I can't read my own writing. This spurred a week of fighting as each side tried to get an advantage. By September 14th, the two armies were concentrated around Sharpsburg, west of Antietam Creek. Sharpsburg. The Union had 75,000 men, while the Confederates only had 40,000. Furthermore, the Union had acquired somehow, the battle plans had fallen into their hands, had acquired a copy of the Confederate battle plan. Somehow or other, the Confederate battle plan had fallen into McClellan's hands. Still don't know how that happened, but there it is. On September 17th, a series of uncoordinated assaults across a cornfield by Union troops met a Confederate corps led by Stonewall Jackson. The cornfield changed hands 15 times, but Jackson held the cornfield. So, they called him Stonewall after that. The Union was able to break through the Confederate center. Here's where it gets dicey. McClellan withheld the reserves, which allowed the Confederates to restore the line. Union troops crossed the narrow Rohrbach Bridge, even though the creek was very shallow. They could have forded the creek with all their men. They could have sent all their dudes across at once. Instead, they sent them two abreast across this little bridge. This bunched up the Union troops, so the Confederates killed many of them. Eventually, the Confederate right was pushed back to Sharpsburg. Again, McClellan failed to commit his reserves. The Confederate reinforcements forced the Union troops to retreat. The battle subsided and Lee retreated. He had just lost too many men. 12,000 Union troops and 13,700 Confederate men died. McClellan was subsequently dismissed, and rightly so. Here we go. This was a clusterfuck all around. All the way around. Everybody here screwed up. The Confederates let their battle plan be known. The Union did not capitalize on that battle plan. Maybe they didn't trust the plan. Maybe they thought it was a decoy. I don't know. But if you know where the bad guys are, the enemy, if you know where the enemy is, and you know where they're concentrated, and you know what they're planning to do, it shouldn't take a genius to countermand all that, to counter all that. Instead, you send a series of charges across a cornfield. I don't know. Lee was, in my opinion, the better commander. His defenses were so good that he held the area, even though the enemy had his plans. McClellan had the enemy's plans and still screwed the pooch. He was overconfident when he should have been methodical, and he was overcautious when he should have reinforced the front with his reserves. Twice. His failure to commit his reserves on those two occasions led to his troops' retreat. Now, there was a junior, I shouldn't say a junior, but a Union general named Burnside. He's the guy who sent his troops across that narrow bridge. Yeah, he messed up too, because he could have sent waves of them over all at one time. Instead, he bunched all of his guys together across that bridge, and that killed a lot of Union troops. All in all, too damn many men died for too little gain, and this had to demoralize the troops on both sides. As a soldier, you have to have faith that your commander will not waste your life. It's one thing to say, this attack has to go through because we need to achieve X objective over there. We're using you as a decoy. It sucks, but that happens in war. We have to achieve this objective no matter what, so just keep going forward no matter what. It sucks, but that happens in war. This is a whole different critter. This is we're going to see how many men we can put up in the front to get killed, and even though we know better. And they did know better. Oh, okay. That being said, McClellan was instrumental in this clusterfuck. There's no other word for it. When you know what the enemy's doing, you have their battle plan, and you still fail to achieve the objective, yeah, it's on you. So he got dismissed, and rightly so. In October of 1862, General Ambrose Burnside, recently promoted to command the Union Army of the Potomac, guided a Union advance into Virginia. The Civil War was raging pretty good, and he was attempting to outflank General Robert E. Lee's forces by crossing the Rappahannock River near Fredericksburg. Seemed like a reasonable idea, so here we go. In a monumental logistical clusterfuck, they had to wait 3 weeks for pontoon bridges to arrive. This allowed Lee to adopt strong defensive positions along a ridgeline around Fredericksburg. So he showed up and was waiting on the pontoon bridges for 3 weeks, and the enemy knew he was there. They reinforced their position and built some strong fortifications, and they were set. He gave them 3 weeks to do that. Even after the pontoon bridges arrived on November 25th, Burnside waited until early December to begin his assault. This made no sense because Confederate reinforcements under General Jackson were en route. So he knew the enemy had reinforcements coming, and he still didn't attack. Okay. When the assault began, Burnside's men laid the bridges, taking heavy casualties from Confederate marksmen on the other side of the river. So in broad daylight, they're laying these bridges, and the Confederates on the other side are picking them off. Say what you want about the South. They may not have been absolutely prepared for this war, but the South had some pretty damn good marksmen. They knew how to shoot, because that's what they did. They hunted. That's what they did. So they're laying these bridges, and the marksmen are picking them off. The assault itself was horrific. On the right flank, Union troops made nine separate assaults in one day against a Stonewall defense on Marye's Heights, M-A-R-Y-E, Marye's Heights. I hope Marye's. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. But anyway, that's where they were, and the Union troops made 9 separate assaults, and the Confederates held. If I'm not mistaken, that might be where Stonewall Jackson got his nickname. The Union troops took thousands of casualties with no tactical progress. They just walked their men into meat grinders over and over. On the left flank, the Grand Division did penetrate the Confederate lines, but Burnside gave them no follow-up support, and they were eventually forced to retreat. They lost nearly 50% of their strength. So, after one day of actual battle, the Union assaults were called off. Burnside lost 12,000 men. Confederate forces lost only 5,000. Let's talk about this. As a military commander, when you send men into battle, you want to give them every advantage. You want surprise. You want overwhelming numbers. You want better technology, better weaponry. You want the high ground if you can get it. I mean, just every advantage you can think of. Put the sun in the bad guy's eyes, in the enemy's eyes. Whatever. Just any advantage you can get. Okay? You want to give your men every advantage if you're going to send them into combat. This is a textbook case of how not to conduct a battle. Burnside gave Lee every advantage. He announced his plan well in advance so Lee could shore up his defenses. He showed up and was waiting on the pontoon bridges. Lee says, "Oh, look, they're over there. They're going to attack us. Let's shore up our defenses." You know. Burnside waited so Confederate reinforcements could arrive. He was, so nice. Let's let them get as many men as they can over there before we attack. Yeah. Burnside ordered his men forward into the barrage over and over again. If you go twice and you're not making any headway and you're taking lots of casualties, maybe it's time to rethink your situation. Just saying. When his men did penetrate the enemy lines, Burnside gave them no support. He had no troop. He didn't send any troops in there to help fortify the ground that they took so that the enemy was able to come and take it back. Just over and over and over, one bad decision after another. It's essentially, Burnside took command of the Potomac and said, gee, let's see how many of our men we can get killed. I don't even know what to make of that. That's just a waste. If I were President Lincoln at that point, if all Burnside's did at that point was get fired, he'd have been lucky, because that, oh my God. If there's a way to lose men, buddy, he found it. When I do this channel, I do military blunders. I do it primarily. I'm not like I don't have like a college degree in this kind of thing, but I know basic tactics. I am a military veteran. I know basic tactics, and I know. I mainly do this so that other war gamers can learn from the past, because that's my hobby. I'm a war gamer. I like to throw some history in there at the same time. I do military blunders to try as an instruction tool for tactical and strategic wargaming. This is literally how not to conduct a war. You don't send your men into a meat grinder. You give them every advantage. You don't give the enemy every advantage like this guy did. Oh my Lord. Santa Anna's Texas campaign. For those of you who aren't aware or aren't really big history buffs, Texas was part of Mexico. They declared their independence prior to the Civil War, and then they later became part of the United States. And then they left again during the Civil War, to join the Confederacy. And then, of course, they came back after, and Texas is a great state. Anybody who's ever been there, the people are wonderful. Everything about it is good. There's not a bad thing about Texas that I can think of, except maybe there's too many Democrats. Other than that, it's really, really good because it's brilliant. What I'm talking about now is when Texas left Mexico, they declared their independence for Mexico and became an independent republic. And the Mexicans weren't real. The Mexican military and the Mexican government wasn't real happy about that. So the Texicans kicked all of the Mexican army out of Texas, and Santa Anna went to reclaim it. General Santa Anna of Mexico wanted to keep Texas as part of Mexico. The Texas citizens wanted to be an independent republic. The Texians kicked the Mexican army out of Texas, and so Santa Anna gathered an army of over 6,000, and his target was the old mission, the Alamo, at the political center of Texas at the time, a town called Bexar. And I think right now that's around San Antonio. Which makes sense because that's where the Alamo is. Okay. Rather than advance along the coast, where he could receive supplies and reinforcements by sea, Santa Anna chose to turn inland toward Bexar. His men were raw recruits who could not aim their muskets, and they resisted firing from the shoulder due to the recoil. His officers were training the men en route. Many of his civilian teamsters quit when their pay was delayed. Supplies were scarce, and there were not enough mules to carry it all. The entourage of women and children who followed his army further strained his supplies. His men were reduced to partial rations. He started his march in December of 1835, and by February, the freezing temperatures and 15 to 16 inches of snow hampered the Mexican army. Hypothermia, dysentery, and Comanche Indian raids took their toll. Santa Anna sent troops to prevent reinforcements from arriving to the Alamo, but refused any negotiations except for unconditional surrender. He was flying the blood red flag, meaning no quarter, meaning there was going to be no mercy. That's not a good way to start out. well, let's get on with the video, and I'll get to the end here shortly. Santa Anna was reinforced with 1,000 fresh soldiers, which, I would imagine along the way, between all the things that were happening, they probably lost a lot of guys, and he was reinforced with 1,000 fresh soldiers. The Battle at the Alamo is iconic. It's a piece of American history, especially in Texas. The assault lasted 13 days and cost the Mexican army, depending on who you listen to, between 400 and 1,600 dead and wounded. But the savagery employed by the Mexican army spurred the Texians to rally, and at the Battle of San Jacinto 2 months later, the Mexican army was surprised and routed in 18 minutes. Santa Anna was captured and the war was over. There's so many things Santa Anna did wrong here. Let's look at what he did wrong. Pretty much everything. He did not train his men properly. His men were not trained. Logistics and supplies were lacking. In this case, they were a joke. The route he chose prevented resupply easily, and when you're marching that many men, you got to have supplies. Logistics becomes not only nice, but a necessity. Logistics is important in every army. The old adage, an army travels on its stomach. Oh my God, it's true. It's absolutely true. He brought an entourage which stretched his supplies. Who brings women and children on a military campaign? This guy fancied himself aristocracy, I guess, and decided that he was going to bring all of his women and their children and blah, 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 maids and housekeepers and blah, blah, blah with, I don't know what all it was. Nobody knows. Nobody cares. All I know is those people had to be fed. And when your supplies are stretched thin, the last thing you want is more people to feed. Should have left them home. That's all I'm saying. He chose to march in winter knowing that bad weather would hamper him. In World War II, the Nazis were hampered by the Russian winter. They had mechanized, tanks and trucks and like that. Imagine marching through all of that. Imagine marching through all of that. It boggles your mind. Sorry, doggy emergency. Where was I? Okay. He could have taken the Alamo with no bloodshed because they were negotiating. Had he negotiated, he could have taken it without losing a man. But he wanted to make a statement to convince the Texians to surrender. I learned a long time ago, in Texas, if you're going to do it, just do it. You don't make a statement. You don't slap a Texas person, a person from Texas. You do not slap a Texan. You don't do it. Santa Anna learned that the hard way. The statement that he made spurred the Texians to rally and fight harder. Texas people have pride, and they have pride for a reason. They earned it. Most people I know from Texas are hardworking, good, solid Americans. They have the backbone prevalent in all of America. And you cannot slap anyone in America, especially a Texan, and them not seek retribution. If you punch a Texan, you're going to get punched back. It's just the way it is. Santa Anna learned that the hard way. So he did pretty much everything wrong on his march into Texas, and he won the Battle of the Alamo. But the way he did it pissed off the Texians, and they fought back harder. He was defeated in 18 minutes. It's got to be some kind of record. I'm just saying. On the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was a disaster caused by the hubris and impetuous nature of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. In June 1876, during the Indian Wars, a large force of U.S. infantry and cavalry gathered in southeast Montana. Their purpose for being there was to force a group of Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne Indians back into reservations in Dakota Territory. General Alfred Terry commanded Colonel Custer with a force of the U.S. 7th Cavalry to leave their position near the Yellowstone River. Custer's force numbered just over 600. Crow Indian scouts that were working with the army reported a large Indian encampment in the valley of the Little Bighorn River about 24 miles to the west. The number of warriors present in the encampment was not known, but Custer decided to advance. He was afraid that the Indians might slip away. He didn't want them to get away. Major Reno took his men to attack from the south, while Custer and his 210 men would move through the hills and attack from the north. Major Benteen's force would circle out to the southwest. So essentially they had 600 men, but they divided them into 3 groups, and I don't know how important, how smart that was, how tactically sound that was, especially if you don't know the disposition of your enemy. You know what I'm saying? Major Reno attacked only to discover that there were some 2,000 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors. They had, and these warriors had far more firearms than were thought. The Indians were surprised by the attack, but quickly organized and counterattacked. That's one of the things that people misunderstood back in the day. For whatever reason, they underestimated the opponents. This happened a lot with the British, and it happened a lot with the American Army. American Indians were not stupid. They may have been technologically challenged, but their tactics were sound. They were well organized. They had a thriving culture. People underestimated them on a battlefield, and that's something you should never ever do. Reno was forced to adopt defensive positions. Benteen joined Reno, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. As casualties began to mount, Reno ordered the combined group into the wooded hills nearby, where they fought for their lives for 2 days. So those 2 groups were just completely out of the picture after that. Custer's command had been surrounded on a hilly ground about 4 miles away. His entire command was slaughtered. The area is now known as Last Stand Hill. One of the first rules of war is to know your enemy. Part of that is to know their number and disposition. Custer knew none of that. He was anxious to score a victory and earn praise and accolades. Everything that I've read about him, he was kind of addicted to the fame. He was addicted to the limelight, for lack of a better word, and he wanted that. He led his command into a slaughterhouse because he wanted the glory, and it's not good to say that about a commander, but that's pretty much what it was. He underestimated his enemy, and he paid the price, and that's just not good in any... I can't tell you exactly why he did it, but he did it, and there it is. When I've done other videos where there's commanders do crazy things and you don't know why, at least we have a look, because he's more of a historical figure. We have more of a look into his psychological makeup. We know him during the Civil War. We know him during his career. There's been a lot written about him, a lot of research been done. From everything I've heard, he just wanted the limelight. He wanted to score a victory and get the limelight, and he underestimated his opponents, and his opponents whooped his ass. That's all there is to it. Unfortunately, all of his men paid the price with him. So that's the problem when you're a military commander. It's not just you that suffers. Is Isandlwana. I believe that's how it's pronounced. 1879. The Victorian period was not a good time for the British Army. A common underlier for many of the disasters suffered by British commanders was their chronic underestimation of whatever enemy they faced. And you see it in a lot of the writings of the time. My wife enjoys period pieces where the officers came from the upper crust, the rich people, as it were, and because you could buy a commission, and the ranks were filled with the lower classes, and at the time that was commonplace in the British Army. Well, the problem was a lot of the people who bought commissions, they weren't worth a shit on a battlefield. They had no idea what they were doing. Now, that being said, this is an entirely different matter. It's one thing to not know what you're doing on a battlefield. It's another thing to take racial prejudice, to look down on people because of the technology they don't have. And that is a quick way to get your ass whooped on a battlefield. That's all I'm saying. A good corollary here was America during the Vietnam conflict had every advantage. The Viet Cong defeated us with sharp sticks and AK-47s. That's it. We had air power, we had artillery, we had tanks, we had almost an unlimited supply of supplies, logistics, and we still lost. It's not what you got, it's how you use it. Here we go. In January of 1879, a column of 17,000 British and native allies invaded Zululand with the intent to bring all of southern Africa under British rule. The British troops were led by Lieutenant General Frederick Thesiger, Lord Chelmsford. That was his title, Lord Chelmsford. And that's what I'm going to call him, Chelmsford in this. It's easier than saying all that other stuff. Earlier, there had been a pretense at diplomacy. They didn't really want diplomacy, they wanted the land. So, and gee, the only people on there are those pissant little natives. They're not going to do anything. Guess what? They is a little miffed. And rightly so. Somebody comes to take your land, yeah, you get pissed. Well, there you go. Chelmsford crossed Zululand and made camp on the plain around Isandlwana Hill. This encampment was only about 2,800 strong. The rest of it, he divided his forces into three columns, and the center column was only about 2,800 strong, less than 3,000. The rest of them were in the other two columns, and they're not even in this story. They don't even figure into it. To make matters worse, his overconfidence led him to not make any defensive arrangements around this camp, other than pickets in the surrounding hills. On January 20th, Chelmsford began sending out large scouting parties trying to locate the Zulu army. This further cut his camp force down to about 1,700, so he sent about 1,100 guys out on scouting parties trying to find the Zulu army. Well, he found them. His scouting parties didn't, but he did. On January 22nd, the British camp found itself attacked by over 20,000 Zulu warriors. The British thought the Zulus were savages fighting with sticks. In reality, the Zulus were a sophisticated warrior society arranged in IMPI. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. MPI. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. But that's how they were arranged. And that's a type of a regimental formation. They had modern military tactics. And they had good leadership. Really good leadership. What the Zulus lacked in technology, they more than made up for in tactics, strategy, leadership, and logistics. They had every advantage. The only thing the British had were rifles. That's it. The Zulu army overwhelmed the camp with only 55 Europeans and about 300 native troops surviving the massacre. They really put it on them, and rightly so. Somebody invades your land, you got to take the appropriate measures. This was the appropriate measures. The blunder here was Chelmsford's clear underestimation of the Zulu army. While they fought primarily with spears, iron spears, the Zulu army was well disciplined, well trained, and well led. A smart spearman will beat a stupid rifleman every time. Intelligence is not based on skin color or sophistication, but rather on an individual basis. A good leader makes up for his technological shortfalls, and poor leaders rely on it. The Zulus simply had smarter leaders, and that's an absolute fact. At one point, prior to the Zulu attack, a group of British engineers arrived, but they were under the same mindset as Chelmsford. They sent the vast majority of their guys out on scouting missions, so they didn't even figure into this either. What this boils down to is, they went into the wrong neighborhood and pissed off the wrong people, and those people decided to defend what was theirs. It doesn't get much more simple than that. And the British underestimated everyone they went against, and that you just can't do that. You cannot do that. This was not a good day for the British Army, and the Zulus were very, very aggressive, victorious, and rightly so. In 1899, the Boer War began in South Africa. In November of 1899, the Boers laid siege to the town of Ladysmith in southern Natal. In mid-January of 1900, a British relief column of around 15,000 men was sent to secure an area of ridges and hills on the approaches to Ladysmith. The dominant feature in this ridgeline was Spion Kop. It's a kind of a mesa. It's a flat-top mountain, a mesa. At any rate, the idea behind this column was they were going to try to secure the entryway to this area so that they could go and give relief to the town of Ladysmith. On the night of January 23rd, 1900, a force of 1,700 British soldiers ascended the southwest slope of Spion Kop. At around 0400, they reached the flat plateau summit and in dense fog, so they couldn't hardly see anything. Visibility was less than 100 meters. They ousted a Boer force of 70 soldiers and suffered only 3 casualties, so they were feeling pretty good. They enjoyed the success and spent the remainder of the night digging trenches. Now, digging trenches in this area was tough because the ground was so hard. It was very rocky. So it was very spotty, and you couldn't dig very deep. When the sun rose, the fog dissipated. The British then realized that they were not on the highest point of the plateau. There was another ridge line with 3 other high points, all occupied by Boers. The Boers, the fog lifted and they looked down on an area, they were right there. The British were right there in the open, because there wasn't a heck of a lot of cover, These positions provided ideal up on the high ridges. These high ridges positions. Let me start that over. These positions on the high ridges gave the Boers ideal positions to fire down into the British trenches and sweep the plateau clean. The ensuing slaughter lasted all day. Between gunfire and close quarter fighting, the British finally withdrew at 1800, at 6 o'clock in the evening. The British losses were 650 dead, 554 wounded, and another 170 taken prisoner. This was a debacle. A lot of people try to blame this on the commander, saying he was the overall commander of the column. But I'd rather blame it on the guy who thought he'd reached the peak but hadn't. The primary mistake in this case was the failure of the British to realize exactly where they were. They assumed that they were on the highest point, and they were not. The high ground is a basic military tenet where the enemy has to fight uphill while your weapons benefit from increased range and your fire can be directed down on the enemy's positions. Which, in this case, when the fog lifted, the Boers were able to fire right down into the British positions, and the British had no cover. They were stacking dead bodies up trying to find cover. It was like a gift from the fates of war for the Boers. When that happened, if you're the military commander, the first thing you do is order a retreat because you're in a bad position. You can't possibly fight uphill to get these guys to secure one of the other positions. You can't stay there and you can't move forward. It's time to get the hell out of Dodge. There's a point where you turn Mother's picture to the wall and retreat. They didn't do that until 1800, 6 o'clock that evening. From dawn till 6 o'clock that evening, they were just taking fire. Location and knowing your position is essential in any military campaign. The British failed in this and they were decimated. The Boers didn't even have to have really great weaponry. All they needed was be able, oh look, there they are, bang, It's one thing to take a hill, but make sure you're at the top, fellas. That's all I'm saying. Gallipoli. There was a really great movie that came out years ago. Mel Gibson was in it, and there was somebody else. I can't remember his name. But they did the movie called Gallipoli. Go watch that. It's really good. I'm going to break it down here. In World War I, the Russians were suffering a heck of a beating. They were getting the snot kicked out of them. And they were desperately requesting that their allies, the British and the colonial forces, give them some sort of relief. And they specifically requested a new front be opened up in the Mediterranean against Turkey, Germany's ally. For those of you who don't know, fighting a war is bad. It's difficult to win a war without significant technological edge and blah, 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 blah. Well, back in World War I, nobody had a technological edge. Technology was in its infancy. So everybody was on the same footing. It came down to numbers. Who had the most people? Consequently, the more allies you had, the better off you were. Well, Russia was surrounded. They were fighting Germany on the Eastern Front, and when Turkey joined the war, they were fighting on multiple fronts. Fighting a war on two fronts is ridiculous. Okay? The idea behind the second front in the Mediterranean was to give the Turkish military something else to think about, so that they're not steady pounding Russia. You know what I mean? The idea was to take the British idea, the Commonwealth idea, the Allies. The idea was to take the Dardanelles, which is a thin strip of water between the Gallipoli Peninsula. I can't even talk this morning. The Gallipoli Peninsula and Turkey. This would allow a supply line to Russia through the Sea of Marmara. I'll get it right in a minute. I got it wrote down. I still can't read it right. That's pretty amazing. The first attempt was completely naval type situation. They were trying to take it with just the Navy. The first attempt resulted in the loss of 3 Allied battleships due to sea mines. They had mined the area. So naval, it wasn't getting it done. The British High Command then opted for a land campaign to take Gallipoli. The first amphibious landing had to be aborted due to landing errors. This was the first blunder, and in my opinion, it started a domino effect. Once this happened, everything beyond it cascaded into failure, and I'll get to that in the end of this. This incompetence allowed the Turkish defenders time to reinforce. You give somebody time and let them know you're coming, yeah, they're gonna clean your clock. It's just the way it is. On April 25th, 1915, the British were able to establish beachheads at Cape Helles, Helles, on the southern shore of the peninsula. I'll get it right in a minute. I'm still trying to make my words. Use your word, Lynn. While the Australian and New Zealand troops occupied Anzac Cove 10 miles up the eastern coast. So you've got this peninsula. The British troops established a beachhead on the south, and 10 miles up on the eastern side, the Australian and New Zealand troops got a beachhead too. So you had 2 beachheads, right? Despite the beachheads, the Allies failed to exploit their grip on the peninsula. This left the British and Commonwealth troops trapped under Turkish guns, artillery, and German Maxim machine guns. Okay, did a video on the Somme. Go check that out. Between the constant shelling and waves of disease, by the 6th of August, the Allies had suffered 30,000 casualties. That's appalling. And they hadn't made any progress. They're stuck on the beach. Okay. The British made for their landings... the British made further landings, I can't read my own writing now, at Suvla Bay, just to the north of Anzac Cove. So you've got the British here, you've got the New Zealanders and the Australians here. Just north of that, another British beachhead. Poor command and a lack of initiative left those troops in the same predicament as the first two landings. So they're just targets. By 9 January 1916, the Allied troops were evacuated. The debacle cost the Allies 46,000 dead and more than 150,000 wounded. 196,000 casualties. Because they couldn't figure out how to get off the beach. In any amphibious landing, surprise and a quick progression of objectives is paramount. You don't land and sit there. You land and you move and take this. You land and you move and take that. Whatever you're going to do it. Don't sit there. The enemy probably knows you're coming. In this case, they were forewarned because the first landings failed. They're like, holy crap, they're going to land over here. Put troops over here. Let's get machine guns up there and artillery. Now, as soon as they come, we'll pound them. That's basically what the Turks did. And you can't blame them. Any idiot would do that. And I'm not calling the Turks idiots, but I'm saying that anybody would do that. It doesn't take a genius to say, oh, they're going to land over there. Let's get our artillery over here and get some machine guns set up so when they do, we can kill them. That's war. Okay? You have to hit them with surprise. They have to be surprise landings. On other amphibious landings, for example, in World War II, the D-Day invasions, the Germans sort of knew they were coming, but the surprise of hitting them and then trying to get off the beach quickly, that was the key. We lost a lot of guys on D-Day, but it could have been a lot worse. If they'd have just sat there, they would have all been wiped out. Because the Germans had significant defenses already lined up, machine guns, artillery, they had tanks in reserve. They were ready. They knew an invasion was coming. They just didn't know where or when. So they had it set up, and luckily in the areas we hit, the French resistance was able to destroy a lot of their logistical stuff, their infrastructure, the trains, the communications, that kind of thing, and we were able to advance further than just the beach quickly. And that's the idea: get off the beach quick. Go find some place to hide. Take one of their places and be able to maneuver and get inland. Simply dropping your guys off on the beach under the enemy guns with no plan to move forward inland off the beach just creates a shooting gallery with your troops as the targets. And that's what happened here. The British and the Allied people didn't have a plan once they established the beachhead. I think they were just surprised they established the beachhead. Okay, what do we do now? I don't know. That kind of thing. Improper planning and a lack of initiative can kill a lot of people. It'll fill a lot of coffins. That's a fact. You can ask any military leader that, and they'll tell you that. That's what happened here. Improper planning and a lack of initiative. What I mean by the lack of initiative, the commanders, once they're on the beach, they realize, gee, we're sitting ducks here. Let's get the hell off this beach. Okay? Improper planning and a lack of initiative. They just sit there. So, again, any military campaign can suffer losses due to circumstance. Most of those cases are not the commander's fault. But for a true military blunder, the military commander has to make a basic mistake, and a big one. Here we go. Ready? The Battle of the Somme, World War I. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 is widely regarded as the archetypal military disaster. Can't read my own damn writing. Field Marshal Douglas Haig planned an offensive. He wanted to push 3 British armies and 1 French army to advance along a 31-mile front. On June 24th, a 6-day barrage began that fired 1.7 million shells into the German positions, which were the target of the offensive. They had a number of objectives they wanted to do, and the first one was these positions. About a third of these shells failed to explode, which meant that the German barbed wire defenses were mostly intact. German casualties were significantly reduced because the Germans were very, very skillful at digging underground bunkers. They were really, really good at it. The foot offensive was scheduled for the 29th of June, but was delayed until July 1st due to torrential downpours. It turned the terrain into sucking mud. When the British soldiers went over the top, meaning they climbed out of their trenches and went to attack, German machine guns, small arms, and artillery fire massacred them. On the first day alone, more than 20,000 soldiers were killed and over 36,000 were wounded. Entire battalions were slashed down to a few hundred men. It was just, This slaughter continued as the offensive continued. It went on until November. Casualties after that first day dropped to an average of about 3,000 per day. The offensive had daily objectives, and some units took until November to secure the day 1 objectives. Now, Allied commanders clearly underestimated the capabilities of the German machine guns paired with ordinary barbed wire. Groups of soldiers are stuck in one spot while they cut through the wires, and the German machine guns just simply mow them down. You got a group of guys running up to the bad guys. They hit this barbed wire. They have to stop and cut their way through. The guys are there. The machine gunners just mow them down. I know it sounds stupid, but that's the reality of it. Add in the German small arms and artillery, and it's a recipe for wholesale slaughter. Now, my question is, at what point as a military commander do you look at the mass casualties versus the minimal gains that are being achieved and say, gee, this doesn't seem to be working, maybe we should call this thing off, hold what we got if we can, if not, pull back, regroup, find a different way. Here's the thing. The artillery was not as effective because they had a lot of bad shells. That's logistics. That's not the commander's fault. Nobody can control the weather, at least not that I'm aware of. At least not. And back in World War I, modern, they didn't have modern meteorology, so you couldn't even accurately predict a lot of the weather. June and July are rainy months to begin with, so it was a bad time to plan such an offensive. But it beats the heat of August. I'm just saying. So none of that you can really, and a winter offensive is just stupid, especially back then, because they didn't have cars, they didn't have tanks or transports or anything like that. It was all foot and cavalry. So winter offensives were rare and dangerous. So none of that is the commander's fault. But the foot offensive lasted from the 1st of July through November. That's over 4 months of this. He had all the guy doing this, whoever was in charge, had all that time to say, holy crap, no, stop, screw that, stop this. And he didn't. He just kept it going like a fucking meat grinder. Imagine being the small unit commander on the front, sending back word saying, hey, we're getting killed up here, what do you want us to do? And the reply keeps coming back, keep trying, move forward. There's a guy over there with a machine gun and open ground. What What move forward is there? Okay, guys, march to your doom. At some point, military commanders need to listen to their subordinates. I have to imagine at some point one of his subordinates said, "Sir, maybe we should pull back. This isn't working." You know? That commander was not in it alone, but he was ultimately responsible. What was his name? Haig. Field Marshal Douglas Haig was the guy who did this, apparently. And I would imagine in military circles that dude is infamous. I'm just saying. In June of 1942, Japanese naval forces under Admiral Yamamoto suffered a devastating loss to American forces in and around Midway Island. Midway was America's westernmost outpost. It sat 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii and it was an early warning and listening post. The Japanese referred to it as Hawaii's sentry. The sentry for Hawaii. Yamamoto thought that if he eliminated it, it would demoralize Americans so much that they would force their government to sue for peace. and it would give them a good shot at getting to Hawaii too. So, you know, if they had a base that close, yeah, hell yeah. He drew up a plan which would commit virtually the entire Japanese Navy to the attack. This would give him overwhelming naval superiority. Now, let's think about this. If he succeeds in this, not only can he launch major assaults on Hawaii and have a good chance to take it, I mean overwhelming chance to take it, but it would demoralize the American people to the point to where they would get their government to sue for peace. That's his brain working. If that's the case, this one attack could have literally knocked America out of the war. He would have won the war with this one attack. So I understand him committing everything to this. The Japanese High Command immediately changed the plan, reducing his naval strength. They also added two new objectives to the plan. The first was an attack on the Aleutian Islands to the north. Their reasoning was they were going to try to draw American forces away from Midway to make the job easier. The second objective was an assault on Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea. This would allow Japan to threaten Australia. This would further divide Yamamoto's forces. Now, I understand the reasoning for wanting to divert American forces away. The problem is, with Yamamoto's plan, you put all your eggs in the same basket and then you crush the basket. You see what I'm saying? It's going to sound bad. Yamamoto's plan was better. Okay, let's get into the rest of it here. American naval forces attacked the Port Moresby strike force in the Coral Sea. Yamamoto had loaned them 3 carriers. The carriers were supposed to help with the attack there and then come back to help him with his attack on Midway. But the American naval forces attacked the Port Moresby strike force in the Coral Sea. They sunk one Japanese carrier, heavily damaged another. They also stripped the third of its aircraft. The Japanese were convinced that they had sunk both American carriers in the Coral Sea, Lexington and Yorktown, while in reality, Yorktown limped back to Pearl Harbor for repairs. There were 2 other carriers at Pearl, and Yamamoto knew that they were there. That's why he wanted all the overwhelming firepower. Now, codebreakers identified Midway as the target of Yamamoto's forces. Repairs on Yorktown were rushed, and all 3 carriers steamed from Midway. Yamamoto did not bother to confirm that the carriers were still at Pearl Harbor when he launched his attack. The Aleutian campaign did not draw American forces away from Midway, and in fact, it utterly failed anyway. You can do. I could probably do one of these military blunder videos on the Aleutian campaign. It was crazy. The Americans that were on the Aleutian Islands and in Alaska fought hard. and the Japanese were ill prepared for it. Anyway, it failed. The initial air assault on Midway damaged the runway but did not knock it out. It also left most of the American aircraft intact. When the Japanese planes returned, Yamamoto ordered them armed with bombs for another strike. While they were being fueled and loaded, American torpedo bombers from the 3 carriers attacked. This was a surprise because Yamamoto only knew of 2 carriers, and he thought they were all the way over at Pearl Harbor. He didn't know they were close by. Virtually all of the torpedo bombers were destroyed. Yamamoto, at that point, knew there were carriers nearby, so he figured it was those 2. So he immediately ordered his planes to be disarmed, to get rid of the bombs, and so that they could be used as fighter cover for the fleet. Zeros are multifunctional. They can be used as fighters. They can be bombers. Torpedo planes. They do everything, and they do it pretty good, but they don't do anything really well. Well, he ordered all of his airplanes to be stripped of their bombs so that they could be used as fighter cover. While that was going on, American dive bombers attacked and destroyed 3 of Yamamoto's carriers. The air cover that Yamamoto had was down looking for torpedo bombers, which are low. They come in low, they drop a torpedo and fly off. The torpedo goes and hits the target. Well, the fighters were down there looking for them, and dive bombers come in high, and they dive straight down really high, a high, steep angle of attack, and they drop their bomb and then pull out. That's what a dive bomber does. So they were out of position, and they couldn't defend the carriers against the dive bombers. 3 of his carriers got destroyed at that point. American losses were 1 carrier, the Yorktown, and 1 destroyer. Japanese losses were 3 carriers and at least 2 heavy cruisers. This was the beginning of the end for the Japanese fleet. They had no way to replace those lost carriers. Their industrial might wasn't what America had. America could replace their losses, and Japan couldn't. So that was the beginning of the end. All in all, the Midway invasion plan was fraught with problems from the onset. So here's the analysis. Yamato's initial plan was good, and in my opinion, it was the way to go. If he could have taken Midway, it may very well have ended America's participation in World War II. Warriors fight and politicians lead. This was the situation here. Japanese intelligence services failed on a number of issues, but the main problem was the high command stripping forces and then adding objectives, which not only forced Yamamoto to divide the forces that he was left with, but added unwarranted levels of complexity to the plan. You want attack plans to be simple. Keep it simple, silly. And when I was in the Air Force, it was keep it simple, stupid. The reason you want it simple is because it's more flexible. You can adjust your plan as needed. If it's really complex, the more complex it is, the more things can go wrong. And that's what happened here. Finally, Yamamoto himself broke one of the cardinal rules of warfare. He assumed where the American carriers were. Naval intelligence told him, the Japanese naval intelligence told him that the 3rd carrier was sunk, while in actuality it was repaired and did in fact join the fight. This whole invasion thing plan for the Japanese was a shit show from the get-go. And most of it was not Yamamoto's fault. I'm just saying. He did bear the brunt of it, and he was responsible because he was in charge, but most of it was not his fault. On Stalingrad, and for those of you who don't know, this took place during World War II, and it was 1942, 43, in that range, no, 1942, excuse me, and this was a major defeat for the German army. Not because of their tactics or their strategies or their people, but because of their logistics. And it fell down to one person, and we'll get to it here in a minute. One of the downfalls of being a leader, a military leader, is that you have to rely on the word of the commanders under you regarding the capabilities of their troops. So if a commander says, I can do this and this and this, you have to take him at his word. And if he can't do it, that's on him. But you could lose because of it. See what I'm saying? You have to have the right people under you in the right positions. Picking good leaders to work under you is the mark of a good leader, a good commander. I saw an interesting debate the other day. Glenn Beck, well, not really a debate, but a conversation. Glenn Beck and Bill O'Reilly. Glenn Beck was saying that the people under Joe Biden and the Biden administration are intentionally trying to destroy America. O'Reilly argued and said, no, they're just incompetent. My contention is the only way you could put people so incompetent in positions of power like that is if you intentionally wanted to destroy the country. That goes right in line with this. If you don't have the right military commanders under you doing the right things, giving you the proper information, bad information will kill an entire army. Here we go. In August of 1942, the German 6th Army and 4th Panzer Army attacked Stalingrad. General Paulus commanded the 6th Army, and by the 23rd of August, they had reached the river Volga. They had forced 3 Soviet armies back into the city. Fierce fighting in very close combat. You know, like, oh, there's a guy in that door over there, let's get him, you know, kind of thing. Room-to-room fighting. Really fierce fighting. Allowed the 200,000 men of the 6th Army to force the Soviets into a 6-mile square area on the Volga's west bank by mid-November. And this was going to be a serious issue for the Russians. The Volga separates, it's right there at Stalingrad, the Volga River. If they had pushed them past the river, I don't think the Soviets would have been able to do anything. They would have been beaten if that happened. Paulus and the 6th Army, supported by the 4th Panzer Army, had done everything they'd been asked to do. Objectively speaking, because I don't like their politics, but Nazis. But objectively speaking, they'd outfought the Soviets splendidly. They had done a wonderful job. They had done what they were asked to do. The only reason the Soviets hadn't been pushed beyond the Volga is that Stalin kept pouring hundreds of thousands of men into the fight. He just kept pouring guys in there. You know, you can only reload so fast, is what it boils down to. On 19 November, a massive Russian encirclement operation was launched. They had all these guys beyond the Volga, and they moved around on either side, and they were going to come in and encircle the Germans and cut them off. That was the idea. In 4 days, by November 23rd, the pinchers were closing shut. Hitler had 2 options. Okay, option A, have Paulus break out to prevent being cut off, turn and come back and withdraw. Option B, have Paulus stay and fight to hold the city. Now, here's the crucial part I'm getting at. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, guaranteed Hitler that his planes could airdrop supplies and maintain the 6th Army to allow them to continue to fight. He guaranteed he could supply them. So Hitler ordered Paulus to stay and fight. He was winning. Why would he withdraw if he knew he could get troops, supplies to his troops? They got to have ammo. They got to have fuel for their vehicles. They got to have, warm clothing and food. If he knew he could get those supplies in there, why would he withdraw? He'd done so well, right? Here's the kicker. Göring's Air Force rarely managed to exceed 80 tons of supplies each day, which was just a bare fraction of what was needed. What people don't realize is that the more advanced an army gets, the more supplies it needs to continue. Guns need bullets, tanks and trucks need fuel, artillery needs shells, and so on and so forth. Your guys have to eat. By February 2nd, the 6th Army had surrendered. They couldn't maintain. They were ordered to stay and fight, and they had no way to continue fighting. 100,000 of them had died, and 100,000 of them had surrendered. It was one of the biggest losses in history. This crushed the myth of German invincibility and was the turning point that put the Nazis on the defensive in World War II. This was such a defeat. I don't understand why Hermann Goering wasn't taken out and shot. Given Hitler's reputation, he probably should have been. My contention is this entire debacle falls squarely on Hermann Goering. A lot of people tend to blame Hitler. Don't take a step back. Don't take a step back. Keep fighting. Keep fighting. He didn't know when to retreat. He was assured by his Air Force commander that they could supply the troops with airdrops. Why would you have them pull back? They were doing so well. Paulus was kicking ass. Why would they pull back? It's one thing, and the argument there is that if they had gotten encircled, that's one thing, gotten cut off, But if they could have supplied them with airdrops, they could have easily withheld until more Germans, another German army could show up and help them out. My contention is Hermann Goering is the blunderer, as it were.
Arnhem. I hope I'm saying that right. Arnhem. Arnhem. This took place during World War II. Operation Market Garden was Field Marshal Montgomery's plan to use U.S. and British airborne forces to capture a series of bridges on the Rhine before the Germans could destroy them. The hope was to get Allied troops across the river and into Germany before winter set in. And each of these bridges, there was a little town there, and the idea was you capture all of them, you can get the entire, right in there before winter set in. And because once winter set in, it was going to take another year to do so. So it would have been nice if we could have done it, but it wasn't a necessity. The idea being we wanted to save lives by shortening the war. That was the point. So the idea was good. Operation Market Garden was launched on September 17th, 1944, with around 16,500 airborne troops being paradropped and another 3,500 landing via gliders. Of the 5 objectives, Zahn, Vagel, and Grave were taken within the day. Nijmegen was taken on the 20th by U.S. paratroopers and the advancing British 30 Corps. The last objective, Arnhem, the northernmost target, was the linchpin that stymied the attack. The British paratroopers were dropped 7 miles from the target. They faced a costly 4-hour fight into the town. Radio communications failed. Unbeknownst to the Allies, the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions were refitting in the area. Only one British parachute battalion reached the bridge, and this was a road bridge because the Germans had already destroyed the rail bridge. So, they were fighting against the odds to begin with, and then stuff started going wrong right off the bat. The unexpected German armor then steadily decimated the British troops on that bridge. They simply couldn't hold it. When you had 2 Panzer divisions coming at you, and then you didn't even know they were there. That was the main thing that hurt them. The rest of the British troops around Arnhem were isolated and outnumbered. Polish military units attempted to fight their way in to reinforce them, but they were unsuccessful. They did try. Market Garden quickly unraveled. Heavy German resistance and the tardiness of the British 30 Corps played major parts in this. The overland advance ground to a halt north of Nijmegen. The British in Arnhem were forced to leave the bridge and fight for survival in the town for 6 more days. And you can't blame them, mate. 2 freaking Panzer divisions. What are you going to do about that? 2,200 Allied soldiers escaped, but 7,600 were killed or captured. During the subsequent 8 weeks, U.S. troops suffered over 3,500 casualties just holding the line. It became a slugfest, and because they didn't capture those bridges, the Germans had the advantage in artillery and like that. Market Garden failed due to a lack of intelligence, which failed to account for the 2 Panzer divisions. That's the primary thing. There were other little things that, communications failures and this and that. But those 2 Panzer divisions were the big deal. On top of that, The failure to drop the British paratroopers on target left them without support. So, on top of not knowing about the two Panzer divisions, the British paratroopers were dropped off target, had to fight their way in, and once they reached the bridge, the main bridge they wanted to capture had already been blown, and the footbridge was on the road there was they couldn't hold it. So the whole thing unraveled at that point. Yeah, this was a failure of intelligence from the get-go. It was a good idea, and if it had worked, it would have done great things. The problem is it failed, and in doing so, it failed big time. So anyway, just goes to show you, intelligence, military intelligence, they say, is a contradiction in terms, but people don't realize how necessary it is until you don't have it or it screws up.
Dien Bien Phu. Anytime a military leader establishes a base, the first priority is location. You need to secure the highest positions and prevent the enemy from taking it from you. You want a good water source, you want a defensible position high up so that the enemy has to work to get to you, much less to physically try to take it from you. Never, ever, ever underestimate your opponent. That's the cardinal rules. If you think they can't do it, chances are they will. They will do it. They'll find a way to do it. That's basically what this video is about. In late 1953, the French in Indochina were trying to end the war with the communist Viet Minh. General Henri Navarre, commander-in-chief in Indochina, came up with a daring strategy. He decided to deploy a large force near the village of Dien Bien Phu. The village was on a wide plain circled by mountains. His intent was to interdict the enemy supply lines and draw the Viet Minh into a crushing conventional defeat. The plan was sound. The basic plan was sound. His intent was to supply the base by air, and supplying that many men, you could probably do it by air, so that's a reasonable assumption. Here's where the plan unraveled. The legendary Viet Minh General Vo Nguyen Giap deployed 5 divisions to encircle the plain to prevent the French escape. Then he had his soldiers and as many civilians as he could find dismantle and manhandle 300 105mm artillery pieces up into the mountains. There were no roads. These people disassembled them, took them up the mountain, and reassembled them. Just sheer manpower. The artillery fire began pounding the French on January 31st, 1954. By April 4th, it was evident that the French were determined fighters, so Giap switched tactics. His 50,000 men began digging trenches toward the French. They call that sapping. Between the steady artillery barrage and attacks which took stronghold after stronghold, the French had a number of strongholds built in the area as part of their base. The Viet Minh took stronghold after stronghold while the artillery continued. The French were beaten back. Dien Bien Phu finally ended with the French surrender on May 7th. French losses were 7,184 dead and 12,000 captured. Giap lost 20,000 men, but this was the beginning of the end of French colonies in Indochina. The French, the issue here was the location of the base. They made their base on a low plain surrounded by mountains because they figured there's no way they could get any sizable forces up into the mountains to pound them. Well, guess what? Giap proved them wrong. Say what you want about him, the man was a military genius. I don't like his politics because he was communist, but the man knew how to fight. The French gave up the high ground and severely underestimated their enemy. It was a shooting gallery for the artillery, and the encirclement prevented the French from leaving. Once you know you're surrounded, you have two choices. You can either break out or stay and fight. Once the artillery started, it was too late for them to get out because they were encircled. The Dien Bien Phu was a clusterfuck from the get-go. The basic idea was sound. You interdict their supply lines. You create a base there so that the enemy has to engage you to open up those supply lines. That plan, that basic tactic, that basic strategy was good. Location, location, location. Bad location killed them. That's what that boils down to. The French had a few tanks. I want to say 6 tanks, and they had some Bearcat fighter bombers, aircraft, but it still didn't do any good. It's just location, location, location. That's all it boils down to.
Operation Eagle Claw was a failed rescue attempt of Americans in Iran by Delta Force operatives, U.S. Rangers, and naval and air assets. A little bit of background here. On November 4th, 1979, Iranian revolutionaries seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 53 occupants as hostages. Excuse me. Still fighting that cold, so bear with me. 6 months of negotiations came to naught, so President Jimmy Carter ordered Operation Eagle Claw to go in and rescue the hostages. And, amen, it needed to be done. Eagle Claw was an overly elaborate plan. It had a number of stages. First, a Delta Force team would be flown in 3 C-130 transports to the remote Dasht-e-Karir Desert. It was codenamed Desert 1, roughly 310 miles southeast of Tehran. They would be accompanied by 3 C-130 tankers to refuel the 8 RH-53D helicopters off of the USS Nimitz, the carrier Nimitz. These 8 helicopters would take the team to a location 5 miles from Tehran. The next day, an agent would supply cars to take the team into Tehran to make the rescue. Meanwhile, U.S. Rangers would seize Mansouriya Airfield to the south. The Delta team would call the RH-53Ds to take them and the freed hostages to Mansouriya Airfield, where C-141 transports would land and fly them out. Now, that was the plan. Yeah, it got fouled up. The Delta team arrived at Desert 1, but encountered significant traffic on a nearby road, forcing them to detain 45 people and destroy a fuel tanker truck with an anti-tank rocket. Yeah. Then, 2 of the 8 Navy helicopters were forced to abort due to mechanical problems. The other 6 flew into huge dust storms, forcing 2 of them to land temporarily. One of the Navy helicopters crashed into a C-130 on the ground, killing 8 aviation crew. Chronically behind schedule, and with several aircraft down, the mission was aborted at Desert 1, so they never even made it close to Tehran. This failure was highly publicized. The rescue of the Iranian hostages was the failed attempt to rescue the hostages was all over the news. This failure was due to over-planning and a lack of ground intelligence and accurate weather reports. Whenever you're planning a military operation, these things are crucial. They're absolutely crucial. If you're planning on infiltrating somewhere, you have to know what's going on the ground. You have to know where you're landing. You have to know civilian traffic in the area. You have to know weather reports. You have to know military assets in the area. I mean, whenever one of these missions is really goes off the rails like this, you've got to look at the intelligence and planning beforehand. This was a very elaborate plan to begin with. There's an old adage, kiss, keep it simple, silly. Well, that's true. That is absolutely true. The simpler the better. Fewer moving parts means less can go wrong. With this, there was a lot of moving parts. The dust storms are the in my opinion, were the thing that really really threw them off the rails, because it's in the middle of the desert. You got to expect dust storms, especially this time of year. And it just threw them off the rails. There was nothing they could do. And a lot of people blame Delta Force or the pilots or whatever, and it wasn't their fault. They were doing what they were ordered. It was the intelligence pre-planning. The intelligence and the pre-planning. That's what killed this. People laugh at military intelligence. They call it a contradiction in terms. And you try to set them straight. No. They do a valuable job. And then you look at something like this, and well, maybe they are. I don't know.
Bravo 20 was a military unit, and they were put into Iraq during the Iraq War. Let me start at the beginning. Civilians, and indeed many military people, tend to frown on military intelligence. I have lost count of the number of times I've heard the old joke, military intelligence is a contradiction of terms. However, military intelligence is a necessity in any military operation. A lack of information or wrong information, bad information, especially key information, almost guarantees a failure of said operation. Let's just get right into this. On January 22nd, 1991, during the First Gulf War, the British military deployed an 8-man SAS team into western Iraq. For those of you who don't know, the SAS is the Special Air Service. It's the British Special Forces, like our Green Berets and Navy SEALs and like that. The mission was to observe and report on enemy troop and equipment movements along a major road through the region. Now, the SAS are supremely qualified to do just about any job. They're very tough. They're some of the toughest people in the world. So putting them in there tells me that this was an important function. Okay? Each man wore lightweight summer clothing and carried 120 pounds of gear. They were supposed to be there for a while. The team was deployed quietly at night, and first light revealed an area much more heavily populated by both military and civilian traffic than was reported, including an Iraqi anti-aircraft position 200 meters from the team's position. Now keep in mind, this is a wartime footing, so any military installation, any military setup like this anti-aircraft position, at night they kept noise and light discipline down, so they didn't want to be seen, they didn't want to be heard. So when these guys were put in there, 200 meters away, you had an enemy installation, and they didn't even know it was there. And that makes sense, because that happens. But their military intelligence should have known that was there. They should have known how heavily traveled this route was. And it was cold. The Iraqi winters can be very, very harsh. The team realized that this situation was untenable, and they attempted to radio for extraction. However, they had been given incorrect radio frequencies. They have protocols for, procedures for when they lose radio contact, communications. So they opted to stay put and wait for their scheduled extraction, just like the protocol said. Unfortunately, they were spotted by a small boy who alerted the nearby troops. Bravo 20 became embroiled in several firefights and decided to run for the Syrian border 75 miles away along the Euphrates River. Freezing winter weather moved in, and the team got separated in a blizzard. One group lost a man through hypothermia and another man was captured trying to obtain a vehicle. One man, Chris Ryan, made it to safety, having walked 186 miles in just over a week. So he was determined to get the hell out of there. You can't blame him. The other group hijacked an Iraqi taxi and were caught in a firefight 4 miles from the Syrian border. One man was shot dead and one man died of hypothermia after swimming the river. The other 2 were captured. Out of 8 men, 3 were dead and 4 were captured. 1 made it out. This is an intelligence and logistics failure. Nobody looked at the weather report. I guess they assumed that because it was the Middle East, it was going to be hot. I don't know. The team was not given proper clothing. Nobody had any cold weather clothing. They did not have proper troop intelligence for the enemy in the area. They didn't have any kind. And in modern times, this is unforgivable. You have resources. You have satellite imagery. You can find out how busy the area is. If there's an anti-aircraft gun 200 meters, the satellite should have picked it up. You see what I'm saying? For whatever reason, they didn't get any of this. And on top of that, the one that gets me, bad radio frequencies. That's just unforgivable. You have to be able to communicate with your team. They may as well have been sent in there without rifles or without food or whatever. That is unforgivable. The team has to be able to call the boss, find out what the hell's going on. This is just ridiculous. The whole point, the mission from planning to them guys being put in there was, to the point where they were inserted into the country, into Iraq, that whole section there was non-existent. I don't know. These guys have a reason to be pissed, and hopefully the 4 that were captured were, released later. I don't know, but if anybody has more information on that, put it in the comments. I'd love to read it. But that was just a failure from the get-go, and it was all in the planning stages. So sometimes you don't have to be a bad commander to lose based on bad intelligence.